I'm Richard Hollingham. Welcome to the Planet Earth podcast with more of that music from Borneo later. Also the hidden treasures that pass most of us by without a second glance.
Even if you saw it on a rock surface, how many people collect it? I would say virtually nobody. Even if you dissolved it out the rock and you looked at it, you probably would not go any further. And so one of the things we have to do is persuade people that this is incredible material.
This week we're at the University Museum of Zoology in Cambridge, which is a hidden gem tucked away off one of the city's back streets. Although you know you've arrived when you see the giant whale skeleton displayed above the entrance. I'm here to talk to Tim Cockrell, and if you're a regular to the podcast, you'll have heard his evocative audio diaries from Borneo. We're going to listen to another of those in just a moment. I've come upstairs to the museum insect room with its creaky floor. Away from the public section there are rows of wooden cabinets, drawers of insects, cases of wasps' nests beside me, even a giant snail on a shelf, and the all-pervasive smell of formaldehyde. Now, Tim, tell me about your research.
Well, as well as working here in the collections in the Museum of Zoology, I also do field work, and we travel out to tropical field sites and we look at rainforests. And the questions that I'm asking are to do with the destruction of the rainforests and how that affects the communities of animals that live there.
And you're looking at oil palm plantations?
That's right, yeah. It's a really big problem in the tropics now, and it's one of the biggest threats that are causing the destruction of tropical rainforests now, is the conversion to agriculture. And in particular, oil palm is a massive problem. It's in everything. It's in all the different foods that we eat. I can guarantee that most people have eaten oil palm or palm oil at least some point today, in fact. It's one of the major drivers of deforestation.
So what does your research involve? You're obviously looking at insects.
That's right, yeah. Insects are really good because they're one of the most diverse groups of animals that we have. So they're really good indicators to see the quality of a habitat. So we go and look in rainforests and in oil palm plantations, and we look at the difference in diversity between the two habitats. And then also I'm looking to see if rainforests can provide some kind of beneficial species to nearby plantations, to look at arguments for their conservation as well.
In terms of the field work, where are we geographically in the world?
So we're in Borneo, a huge island in Southeast Asia. I'm in the Malaysian part of Borneo in the state of Sabah. And Borneo is one of the islands that's well known for its tropical rainforest. It's covered in this lush green tropical rainforest, but unfortunately it's all under threat. So it's not as green and lush as it used to be. It's turning slowly into agricultural land.
OK, so let's hear from Tim in Borneo.
Boleh ba. It's about 6:30am. We've been on the go since about 4:30 this morning, and we're at one of our new field sites. It's a primary forest field site in the Danam Valley Conservation Area, and we're sampling for insects this morning in the canopy, and we're using a technique called canopy fogging. Now this, it seems, is one of those rare days where everything goes perfectly to plan. With this technique we need perfectly dry forests, so any rainfall the night before or the previous afternoon means that we can't do any work. So we set off at about 4:30, we've got an hour's drive to the field site, then we get out of our car, and usually what happens is the rainforest is dripping with rain. So it's a bit of a tall order to ask for a completely dry rainforest, but this morning we seem to have managed it. So we've sampled a couple of sites. What we do is we take a machine called a fogger. It's the same thing that they use to clear mosquitoes from holiday resorts and that kind of thing. And it looks like a huge space-age laser gun. It makes a terrible racket. And we fill up the fogger with a fast-acting insecticide. And we stand below the canopy and we turn on the fogger and we spray this insecticide up into the canopy. And what happens is the insecticide knocks all of the insects out of the canopy and they fall down and we catch them in trays that we've put below. Now it sounds on the face of it like a really destructive technique, going and spraying the rainforest with insecticide, but the reason that we do it at this time in the morning is that this early there is next to no wind in the forest, so we can be really, really specific as to where we pinpoint this fog in the canopy. And on the scale of a landscape like a rainforest, we're sampling absolutely tiny, tiny pinpricks. So the fogging has absolutely no effect on populations of insects. They soon recover. So So by looking at all the things that have fallen down into our trays, we get an exact snapshot, a picture of the whole community that's up there in the canopy. And really, this is the only technique that allows us to do this. So it's time to put the ear defenders and the face mask on and go and fog that final sight before breakfast. Well, I've finished all of my work in the forest now for this year, and in fact for the whole of my PhD. This was my last of 3 field trips. And on my way back to the UK, I've stopped off at the house of Matthew Ngao Jiao, a friend of mine, who's a musician and an artist. And Matthew practices the traditional arts and skills of the Orang Ulu group of people that live traditionally here in Borneo. And particularly, he makes and plays a musical instrument called the sape. And in a way, to me, Matthew represents the way that Borneo used to be before the logging and the oil palm plantations took over. And they really have taken over. I speak to friends of mine who came here 10 years ago, and they tell me that the flight to our field site was mainly over forested land, whereas now the flight to our field site is mainly over oil palm plantation. And for me, it's a really sad thing to see so much of the rainforest destroyed by logging and converted to plantation. And then part of me thinks that, is it really reasonable that in a world of nearly 7 billion people, we should expect one of the most productive places on the planet to be covered with rainforest that is essentially useless when you compare it to oil palm plantation or other kinds of agriculture? But really, I defy anybody who's spent any time in the rainforest at all to say that an oil palm plantation can be better than a lovely primary rainforest. But on the plus side, in Malaysia and in other countries, there are protected areas of forest that, in theory at least, should be safe from logging and conversion to oil palm. The danger, of course, is that if the conservation of our forests worldwide relies on the conservation of these relatively tiny fragments, then the future of rainforests worldwide is built on really, really fragile foundations. And I just hope that if in 10 years' time I come back to Borneo, I'll still be able to find this incredible cultural and biological diversity that I've been lucky enough to experience over the past few years.
Musician Matthew Ngao in Borneo, ending Tim's audio diary. Now, Tim, you've got here in Cambridge a fogger, and it does look exactly like a 1930s sci-fi Flash Gordon gun. Can we just have a look at this? Can you pick it up? Because it looks pretty heavy.
It is, yeah.
It's a kind of two-handed affair. So you point this gun up at the canopy. It's not really a gun. It's a fogger. You point it up at the canopy. It fires up insecticide, and then you get this cascade of insects down.
That's right, yeah, and it was featured in the film Arachnophobia, actually, and there's this famous scene where they kind of go and spray this stuff into the canopy. We do things really early in the morning, so there's absolutely no wind, so this hot fog goes straight up, so we can be really specific about where we pinpoint this stuff. And then, yeah, you spray the thing up, and then we wait a few minutes, and then it literally starts raining insects and invertebrates, so you can stand there and you hear the patter of insects dropping down on the leaves. It's not quite as dramatic as Arachnophobia, where they'd have giant tarantulas and big butterflies dropping down, but yeah, we do have a rain of insects. It's amazing.
I'll let you put that down because it's just heavy. You've got the insects then. You collected them in these trays. You've then presumably done some work out in the field on those. You bring them back here. What do you do with those insects?
So the next stage after we've collected all the insects is to sort them into the groups. So we sort them first of all into things like the difference between spiders and insects and beetles and ants and that kind of thing. And then we assign species to each one. So we don't use actual species. We say basically this looks sufficiently different from another individual to call it an individual species. So then we get an idea of exactly the number of species that are in the rainforest or the plantation at any one time.
So you've got these for the plantation and for the rainforest. Presumably you then can compare the two.
Exactly, yeah. So we do statistical analyses to look at the difference between the two habitats. And at the moment, the stage we're at is we're kind of confirming the obvious, first of all, that the rainforest is much more diverse than the oil palm plantation. And then we're looking at what we call edge effects, so the difference between the two habitats and the boundary between the two, and how one habitat might affect the other in terms of diversity.
And that, in a way, that subtle research is the more interesting in a way, because the palm plantations are here to stay, aren't they?
Exactly, yeah. We're not going to get rid of the oil palm. So one of the only ideas that we've come up with so far in terms of preserving rainforest is that we need to attach value to rainforest. So we can see, is this rainforest going to provide beneficial insects to the plantations, for example? And if it's not, well, it's really important that we know that, so that we don't actually rely on that kind of thing before we think about conservation measures.
Well, Tim Cockworth, thanks for now. You can hear previous audio diaries featuring gibbons, geese and mongooses, not all in the same place, although that would be interesting. On our host website you'll find those, Planet Earth Online, and we'll be back with Tim before the end of the podcast to hear about his flea circus. Fire is usually seen in terms of destruction, but in nature, rather like the mythical phoenix, fire can also provide life and regeneration. And for paleobotanists, fire is also a tremendous untapped resource, giving a previously unseen glimpse into our past. Sue Nelson went to Frensham Common in Surrey to find out for herself.
It's known as a local beauty spot, but it's hard to imagine that now in the corner of Frensham Common that I'm standing in at the moment, because the site in front of me is one of blackened devastation, and all that's left are these charcoal branches that are sticking up from the ground. And that's because in July, just a few months ago, 86 acres of this heathland caught fire. It took over 80 firefighters from 3 counties to tackle the blaze, but not everyone is downhearted about the effect of the fire, especially not Andrew Scott, Professor of Applied Paleobotany at the Department of Earth Sciences for Royal Holloway University of London.
Let's go and have a look across this area. You can notice as we're walking, your sort of feet beginning to crunch, although it's a bit damp today.
It feels like walking through a fire grate.
And if you look here, it's sort of, look at all this residue here. Lots and lots of different sizes of charcoal here.
Now, you've just put a trowel into the ground there. It almost looks like the sort of beautiful darkened compost peat that you might buy from a garden centre.
Yeah, and so you probably think, oh, this is terrible stuff, and you just tread on it and you take no notice. But in fact, this is preserving the plant material as charcoal. What I consider fire as is, if you like, a preservational mechanism for fossil plants. Because in many cases, this charcoal now is the cell walls have been converted to nearly pure carbon, and that material can get buried and survive for millions of years. Not only that, the anatomy of the plants is still preserved in the charcoal. I'll collect a bag of the material so that you can actually see that I'm telling you the truth. Notice that none of the big pieces of wood have actually charred all the way through. The fire here went through quite quickly in very low flames, probably fairly low temperature. And these are very common in the fossil record, producing vast quantities of charcoal that could easily get buried. One of the problems, of course, is that this material, as you commented, who would think of collecting that stuff? You know, even if you saw it on a rock surface, how many people collect it? I would say virtually nobody. Even if you dissolved it out the rock and you looked at it, you probably would not go any further. And so one of the things we have to do is persuade people that this is incredible material. It tells us about not only that there was a fire here, but we can tell what was being burnt. When we're looking at the fossil deposits, you know, we have an insight into the past, into looking at the vegetation, and almost all the different plants will be preserved in this way, so we get a good idea of the total community.
A short drive away, and we're now in Andrew's offices. We've brought some of the charcoal with us, and you've got a microscope here.
You've challenged me to show you what was there, so I'm just going to take some of this sample out.
A spoonful there, a bit like spooning out some tea, isn't it?
Yeah, I suppose sometimes they're often called fossil tea leaves, I think, for some people anyway.
You're using a very fine-tipped paintbrush now to sort through the powdered charcoal.
Yeah, I'll just turn it round.
Okay, let me have a peek. Oh, that looks like a clove in that, as much as it's got a little stick and a roundish head with two little pincer-like protrusions from the top.
That's a charred heather flower.
Gosh!
So obviously you can see the style is coming up. You can see the petals around the outside. So let me find you another bit of the heather.
Paintbrush once again.
This is another one of the flowers that's actually opened up. I clear away around it.
It's only a millimetre or so, isn't it? That almost looks like a miniature black rosebud.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So the charcoal is a treasure trove as far as you're concerned, but why is it important to examine the remains of these plants?
Our thoughts about charcoalified flowers started with the discovery by Elsa Marie Fries and colleagues in Sweden of some Cretaceous material in which they discovered these tiny little flowers preserved as charcoal. And probably 90% of our knowledge of early flowering plants or early flowers comes from charcoal. I think one of the key things is to realise that this was a period when flowering plants first started. We know that many of the flowering plants were small, shrubby, weedy forms, and they survive well in disturbed habitats. But the other thing to know is that, of course, fire is a major disturbance. And if you've got regular fires, then these kind of weedy plants can do very well. They come back very quickly. If the fire return interval is quick enough, you prevent any trees growing. But the question is, why in the Cretaceous? And why is it so interesting? We know from experiments that if you have changes in atmospheric oxygen, that can affect fire. Because if atmospheric oxygen falls below 15%, you don't get fire, it gets put out. If you have much above the present level, you can begin to burn wetter and wetter plants. So the idea we had was that if you're looking ever wet environments, if you have increasing amounts of charcoal, it may indicate that oxygen levels are increasing. So we've just published our research which tries to use this as a proxy of atmospheric oxygen through time. Now it turns out that the Cretaceous, this period of when flowering plants first got going, was a time of high oxygen. So we believe that there were many more fires that could burn. They promoted, if you like, the spread and diversification of early flowering plants.
Andrew Scott from Royal Holloway, University of London, talking to Sue Nelson. And you see some photos of the heath on the Planet Earth Online Facebook page, where you'll also find a video with the fossil trees that we featured in our last podcast. Before we hear about Tim's fleas, I'm joined by Tamara Jones from Planet Earth Online with some other stories that are on the site at the moment. And appropriately enough, as we're surrounded by insects here in Cambridge, a story on ants.
A researcher from the University of Leicester has discovered that workers in Spanish colonies, they're the ones that hold the power. They decide which queen gets to reproduce, and they actually use violence to get their way. But in British and French and German colonies, the workers are much more docile and they allow multiple queens to lay eggs at the same time.
So what do the Spanish ants do that the others don't?
Well, it's a bit grisly. They use violence, they use extreme aggression, and they sometimes beat up queens, and they even kill some queens just so they can get their way.
I do like the idea of extreme aggression. Why do this research, though?
Well, the researchers were really interested in how societies resolve conflict. And because ant societies have been in existence for at least 50 million years, they thought, well, if anybody knows how to resolve conflict, it should be ants.
And if you go to the Planet Earth Online website, you get full details of this story. We're off to Southern Africa for our next one.
Well, this story is about sand in the Namib Desert, which is one of the world's oldest and largest sand deserts. And until now, scientists didn't know how old the sand was, but now they do know, and they reckon it's at least 1 million years old. They know this because they worked out that it takes that long for sand to travel the 400 kilometres from the Orange River, which is where it originates, to travel right up to Walvis Bay in the north.
OK, so 1 million years to travel 400 kilometres. How do they work that out?
They use things like cosmic rays, isotopes, and the fact that some of these sand dunes are about 100 metres high. Really, to find out exactly how they did it, you'll have to read the full story on the Planet Earth Online website.
Very good answer. Well, thank you, Tamara. OK, Tim, let's hear about your fleas. You're building a flea circus. What is a flea circus?
Well, most people nowadays, when you say flea circus, they imagine this showman's trick where there are these mechanical props and magnets and things move, and you're supposed to believe that the fleas are there, but they're not really there, and it's all a bit of fun, really entertaining. But in fact, the history of the flea circus, it actually started off in the 19th century, and there were real flea circuses where real educated fleas, supposedly, and the fleas would be attached to tiny props, they'd pull chariots, they'd kick footballs, they'd juggle things. So it's a genuine thing, but it's been almost lost completely.
Now, I didn't believe you, but you have tubes here with fleas attached to harnesses. These aren't human fleas, are they? They were originally done with human fleas. But these are, what, hedgehog fleas?
That's right, yeah, these are hedgehog fleas. So originally human fleas were the fleas that were available. They were in most houses, they lived in people's beds and bit people every night. But no, these are hedgehog fleas because human fleas have almost died out. They're almost extinct in the domestic situation. So we've used hedgehog fleas, in fact donated by the St Tiggywinkle's Animal Hospital. I'll give them a plug there because they've been fantastic. They've collected these fleas from the hedgehogs, they've sent them over, and I've just started the training process now.
Training process. Okay, can we take one out?
Yeah. Yes, I'm pulling out the wire now. They're attached to a really fine gold wire. The wires.
So you've threaded this wire around. They don't really have necks, do they? But around the top of that abdomen.
Yeah, it's a bit like the neck. It's around the thorax of the flea, so it's between the first and second pair of legs, and it doesn't harm them in any way. It just keeps them secure, basically. And this would be the way that the fleas could be attached to the props that they work with.
Can you show me something then that this flea can do?
We'll see what we can do. I've only had this one a couple of days.
So we've got this little polystyrene bead.
So yeah, so
Very
this
small.
would have been billed originally as the juggling flea. So the flea picks up the ball, it sits on its back, and it walks the ball around, round and round, and its legs like that.
Amazing. So it does indeed appear that the flea is juggling that ball.
That's right. And this is something that hasn't been seen. The last flea circus closed in the UK in the 1960s, and this hasn't been seen for 30 or 40 years. So I'm trying to recreate this so it doesn't get lost forever.
That is genuinely quite impressive. A little bit strange, but genuinely impressive. Thank you again, Tim. Best of luck with the flea circus. That's the Planet Earth podcast for another fortnight. If you like it, do spread the word. You can listen to any or all of our past episodes on Planet Earth online or download them from iTunes. Next time, Sue will be heading north in search of red squirrels. I'm Richard Hollingham, a little bit itchy, at the University Museum of Zoology in Cambridge. Thanks for listening.